The joy of sex. So, one of the things that anyone who's spent any significant time in socialist organizing spaces have to deal with is not just unions, it's not tenant or unions, it's not NGOs, it's sectarian organizations. Now, the critique of sectarian organizations goes all the way back to Marx. In fact, he critiqued Lassalle's movement as being one of the first and primary worker sects. He also basically implies that it was given to almost all the utopian socialists too, something that Engels was to play out in his engagement with the 19th century socialist tradition and socialism, utopian and scientific. But where this is most clear is actually in a letter. Before the Eisenknockers and the General Association of German Workers, or the All German Workers League, or however you want to translate the organization founded by Ferdinand Lassalle, there's a letter to Lassalle's successor, Johann Baptist von Schweitzer, where Marx clearly states his view of sectarianism. Now, unfortunately for us, the full text of that letter has been removed from the internet. It used to be available for free, for now it is not. There are a couple of summations of it, though, and I'm going to have you look at that in the show notes if you want to read it originally. Marx specifically critiques the legacy of Lassalle and analyzes the fundamental difference between a sectarian political movement and a general working class movement. And it's important to remember the strange, intense relationship that Marx had with Lassalle. Lassalle's organization was criticized in the private letter called the draft letter of the Goethe critique, or Gotha critique, excuse me. I always pronounce it like it's Goethe. It's not, it's Gotha. Which we also call the critique of the Gotha program. He's also famously made some racially disparaging remarks about Lassalle, which many people have seized on subsequently. But, you know, Marx cried at Lassalle's funeral and had a few things to say about him here. You must remember this letter was to Schweitzer himself, and so it was a letter of criticism to frenemy. So Marx begins by crediting Lassalle with the immortal service of reawakening the German workers' movement after 15 years of dormancy, when they were defeated as part of the 1848 liberal revolutions. Marx argues that Lassalle, however, made several critical errors by allowing immediate local circumstances to dictate his broader ideology, and by doubling down on that in a sectarian way. Particularly, Lassalle focused on political agitation and demanding state aid for worker associations, countering the Schulze-Delitzsch concept of bourgeois self-help for the working class itself. Marx points out that this idea was unoriginal. It was copied from French Catholic socialists like Philippe Boucher, and also was limited. Because Lassalle insisted this policy was immediately practical, he immediately turned to the Prussian state to implement it, secretly writing letters to Bismarck to try to get help, driving him to make political concessions to the Prussian monarchy, feudal reactionaries, and clerical forces in order to fight the nascent German bourgeoisie. Now, this sounds like opportunism and tailism, and if it stopped here, it would have been, but that's not what happened. Lassalle peddled the demand for state aid with a call for universal suffrage, which was inspired by the British Chartists. Marx critiques him for ignoring that conditions in Germany were entirely different from conditions in England, while also ignoring how the French Second Empire had successfully manipulated universal suffrage to sustain authoritarian rule, basically arguing that universal suffrage was good, but that other things need to happen first. Otherwise, declasse elements and lumpen elements could easily help support an authoritarian demagogue. Marx then explains that Lassalle gave his movement a religious, dogmatic, and sectarian character, acting as he had a panacea for all the masses and relying largely on moral arguments rather than sound theoretical ones. Instead of building on historical and organic elements of the working class movement and their contradictions, Lassalle tried to force the working class into his specific dogmatic recipe, one that Marx specifically took issue with, the iron law of labor being one of them. Marx mentions that he learned Lassalle about these exact errors in a meeting in London in 1862. And, it would come up later on when the General Association of German Workers, or the All German Workers League, again, they're pretty much the same thing. You can translate it either way. Joined with the Eisenknechters to form the SPD. That was Marx's initial hesitation about that joining. Marx applies his analysis directly to Schweitzer, noting that Schweitzer had recently experienced the tensions between leading a dogmatic sect and organizing a real class movement, specifically when Schweitzer had threatened to resignation just to get his organization to back a trade union congress because they were dogmatically opposed to doing so. Finally, Marx reprimands Schweitzer for failing to seize a crucial moment. Following the dissolution of the General Association of German Workers, Schweitzer had an opportunity to dissolve the rigid sectarian framework and allow its members to merge into a broader independent class consciousness movement. Instead, Schweitzer attempted to force the wider working class to subordinate itself to his faction, prompting critics to accuse Schweitzer of merely trying to preserve his own personal fiefdom. Now, there's other things we could talk about in the context of Schweitzer. Schweitzer actually built the dictatorial party model. When Schweitzer took over the presidency of the ADAV in 1867, during a period of intense internal fracturing, his contribution to the formation of the SPD's ancestral DNA lies in his fierce defense of centralized discipline and of democratic centralism, a concept that really begins with him and not Marx. Now, Marx was both a centralist. It's undoubtedly clear, as was Engels, read on authority for this. And Marx was a Democrat, but democratic centralism really began under Lassalle, which Lassalle had near complete structural power within the organization. Schweitzer heavily leaned into this structure, arguing that a fragmented, uneducated working class could not fight a highly centralized Prussian state apparatus without military-grade internal discipline based on the central command. And this legacy actually is maintained through the SPD and into the Bolsheviks. And it's one of the things that I actually do tend to critique the Bolsheviks for, even though people know that I am mostly a Bolshevik defensist. The centralized autocratic style directly precipitated the split within the movement. Frustrated by Schweitzer's top-down leadership and suspicious of his maneuvers, Liebknecht and Bebel broke away to form the Social Democratic Workers' Party in Eisenach in 1869, which is the beginning of the Marxist faction. Their rejoining of the SDAP and the ADAV created the SPD, and it softened the dictatorial role of the party, but it maintained democratic centralism. Paradoxically, it was the structured resilience of Schweitzer's ADAV that forced the Eisenknechters to eventually negotiate on equal terms. But when the two factions finally merged in 1875 at Gotha to form the SPD, the new party adopted the Eisenknechters' broader political platform, but retained the disciplined, centralized organization without the focus on a dictatorial central secretary or president figure. This softer form of democratic centralism is one that I find to be defensible, but it is actually very clear that the DNA of democratic centralism does pop back up with a tendency towards Bonapartist-like structures on the left, both within the party and within the state. Schweitzer's ideological footprint can also be defined by his willingness to negotiate with the realpolitik of imperial unification, something that Marx had been really hesitant to do. He represented a wing of the early German socialism that prioritized concrete concessions for immediate working class reforms over revolutionary organization and what we might call today revolutionary purity. A lot of today's social democrats, what they say they're acting in the name of Marx, are actually acting in the name of Schweitzer and Lassalle. And I do mean that as an insult. Marx, Engels, and the Eisenknachers, and even the French socialists and the left party there, accused Schweitzer of being a secret agent or a tool of Otto von Bismarck. Schweitzer did engage in back-channel dialogues with Bismarck, as did Lassalle before him, viewing national unification and the Prussian hegemony as historically inevitable and something that they could utilize. Marx hated the Prussian state particularly. Ideologically, Schweitzer argued that the working class needed to cooperate with an actually existing state framework, and if Bismarck was going to unify Germany, it was going to introduce universal male suffrage, which Bismarck had done in the Northern German Confederation in 1867. The socialist movement needed to exploit these mechanisms immediately, rather than abstractly opposing Prussia on behalf of a localized bourgeois federalism. At least that was Schweitzer's logic. And again, if that sounds more like social democrats today, even when they claim to be Marxists, it shouldn't surprise us. Schweitzer was one of the very first socialists to be elected to the North German Reichstag, and he utilized the parliament precisely as an agitation platform, a tactic that became a cornerstone of SPT's strategy for the next half century, and one whose obstructionist variety was more or less absorbed by Marx. Schweitzer's legacy is thus ambivalent, and Marx even thought so at the time in his life, and this letter indicates. To the Marxist tradition, particularly the Orthodox one, he was a tragic opportunist who compromised the international and revolutionary potential of a movement for state-sanctioned realpolitik that actually cost the workers in the long run anyway and led to the Socialist parties being outlawed. To the history of the German political associations, however, he was a pragmatic strategist who kept the institutional machinery of German socialism alive. But that's neither here nor there. We can see the critiques of the tactics and their overuse of ideology and opportunism paired together as being the basis for sectarianism. Now, this is interesting because we don't think about opportunism and sectarianism going together. We tend to think today that sectarianism is a product of the left opposition or the left communists or some are anarchists or some other form of ultra, in quotation marks, left formations. But I don't think that's entirely what Marx meant by it, particularly when he talks about it in the letter to Schweitzer. He seems to be talking about pragmatism when paired with dogma-like moralism that often backfired on leadership trying to do pragmatic things themselves. Now, this is really the clearest statement of what Marx thought sectarianism was, and I do think you should go read the letter if you can find it, or at least read the summary link in the show notes. The next major text I'm going to talk about in regards to sectarianism is a classic by Hal Draper, and it's one that I actually do tend to like, and it's called The Anatomy of a Microsect, which was written in 1973. An influential position paper written by Draper on the behalf of the Independent Socialist Committee, which was later on to be merged with the International Socialist Committee, which then in themselves would become part of the larger Cliffite International Socialist tendency and organization, thus creating the ISO, which Draper was not really a part of. The American Internationalist Socialist Organization of Trotskyism, of course, has direct ties to Trotskyism, but also has ties to the British third campism of Tony Cliff, as well as Draper's more left interpretation of Max Shachtman, as opposed to, like, say, Commentary Magazine and Partisan Reviews take on Max Shachtman from the 60s. I need to do a whole history of Shachtman for people one day. I think people don't really know it. Draper's document focuses on a core dilemma that the American left faces, particularly after the establishment of both the New Left and the Communist movement. In absence of a mass socialist movement, Along with the beginnings of deindustrialization, which he doesn't mention, but it's important to note, you had a rampant, fragmented jungle of competing, isolated political sects, something that was very common before 1848 as well, as Marx complained about at the time, but that the early 20th century had largely done away with. The reasons for this are complicated, and I still think a lot about it myself. In fact, there's parts devoted to this in the book that I co-wrote with Daniel Tutt on populism, but that's beyond the scope of our discussion today. Draper begins by offering some more precise definitions to move away from using words like sect as merely an insult. For Draper, a sect is a membership organization whose boundaries are originally defined by its adherence to an ideological, not a mass, political program or specific platform shibboleths that present itself as the embodiment of the socialist movement, but remains isolated from both actual social conflict and any mass base. For Draper, a movement and a party are apart from this. An organization that serves as a general political arm of the sectors of the working class can be called a party, and it reflects a working class in active motion trying to achieve its own demands and act for itself, not just in itself. Rather than demanding the working class conform to preconceived dogmas and prior opportunities. So a party for Draper is both a mass party and one that is ideologically flexible within the limits of what you need for socialism. Draper then goes on to argue that American socialism in the 70s hit a historic low due to extreme sect fragmentation. I mean, for example, Max Elbaum said that there was probably 1 million members of the various communist movements that broke off the New Left post-68 that were racially diverse amongst young Americans, but the consequences of the Sino-Soviet split, as well as sectarian differences and different ideologies emerging both within Marxist-Leninism and with different ideologies in response to what was going in China's reforms between the 60s and 70s, these groups were highly fragmented. I mean, over about 100 groups where this 1 million people built up, so nobody really had the numbers, and it shows. The average sect at this time was less than a few hundred people, with the larger ones were a few thousand. I think the CPUSA was able to pick up some numbers from the doldrums that have been in the 50s and 60s to get to maybe between 7 and 10K. But if you consider its high point in 1948 of 70 to 90K, it seems like a pretty big fall down. So I find that very interesting when we talk about the situation. Which brings us back to the point here. Draper contends that the sects had not just been like Lassallean sects, but were now submicroscopic level sects. He categorizes the sects into two major camps, often reflecting his own Trotskyist biases. We're not going to cut that out. Where he talked about the neo-Stalinist, the Castroite, and the Maoist sects, which he says were driven by political primitivism and an amnesia regarding the Marxist tradition. These groups relied on Jacobin Punchist mindsets. Again, he sounds like Kautsky here. They did not want a democratic class movement. Instead, they wanted to operate as self-appointed elites waiting for an elemental popular upsurge to engineer a bureaucratic revolution from above. This is, of course, a very Shackmanite view of bureaucratic collectivism, and one that I would not totally subscribe to for all the groups that he mentions in this category. And he also doesn't bring up the Sino-Soviet split as part of what's driving this fragmentation, which I find rather interesting. He then talks about the classic sects, the Social Democratic and Trotskyist splinters, of which he was a member very early on. that these groups counterpose their rigid programmatic demands against an actual messy class struggles of everyday workers and can't really do either very well. They refuse to support real world movements unless those movements conform to the sect specific ideology, and that ideology was often in response to other sectarian claims. He also talks about the relationship with the trade unions, which is a fundamental failure, specifically of American sectarianism, according to Draper, which had groups that had adopted left communist hostility to trade unions, at least according to Draper's own perspective. And the reason why this was a problem is not because the trade unions were actually all that useful or good, but they were the only existing mass class organizations in the United States at all. He contrasts the sect mentality with the core strategy of Karl Marx, which requires fusing two elements, supporting elementary class struggle for political steps, or even a smaller reformist, and permeating the struggle with educational socialist propaganda. Basically, the tactical version of the merger formula that you see spelled out by Lars Lee and Mike McNair, and frankly, I think Lenin and Marx, but nonetheless. Draper critiques the new left radicals of the 1960s for swallowing bourgeois academic myths that labeled the organized labor as part of the establishment. Now, I think that there was an establishment leadership in labor. So did Draper, to be fair. But because of their fear of dealing with the workers, they tended to view students as the primary operations of the revolution in this time period, something that almost everybody, including people that Draper would have considered neo-Stalinist, thinks is a mistake now. Even when radicals went to the people and the factories, they acted destructively and effectively for Draper, like the go to the people Narodniki did in Russia prior to the Russian Revolution. Demanding absolute ideological purity from existing unions, or trying to create parallel ultra-radical shop structures that ultimately isolated themselves from other workers. Instead, that Draper basically argued for a united front from below. Then he dismisses the all-inclusive or unity sects like the ones proposed by Peter Camejo, and other ones like dissect and NAM were both very similar. Draper says that merging incompatible programs into larger sects fail because sects lack internal pressure of a real past class to hold antagonistic factions together. Draper, unlike most Trotskyists, does not favor faction bans, but he thinks that the mass participation of the movement will keep the worst tendencies of sectarian developments within a inclusive organization at bay, and without that, they can still run wild. Draper then says something that I actually don't agree with, that attempting to create a sect based on a ruddered down abstract socialist program that every sect or every worker can agree on ultimately reduces the groups to reformism, which he saw as a historical path of the Socialist Party after Debs. Now, what is Draper's alternative? Not one that I particularly favor, to be quite frank, but it's something I've thought a lot about. Since mass movements cannot simply be created by an act of will or organizational fiat, Draper argues that socialists must wait for the social conditions to mature and for the objective and subjective conditions to align for a revolution to happen, so that they should remain a remnant or a center, actively laying a healthy theoretical and ideological groundwork for when that moment happens. And so here's what he suggested for organizing beyond sectarian formations, which was form local reading circles and local circles for everyday practicality. The socialists should form these localized circles of co-thinkers rooted organically in everyday environments, such as workplaces, communities, and existing social struggles and movements. That they should utilize political centers, organizations organized around editorial publications, literature, and educational resources. Historically, Draper used Lenin's Iskra, as well as the Monthly Review and Dissent magazine, as models. This is kind of where the idea that socialists are primarily a publishing org comes from. and that they should maintain a hang-loose relationship, that socialists and social circles should interact with these political centers for guidance, literature, and cross-regional link-ups without officially joining any political party, and even being somewhat careful about associations outside of unions. This avoided rigid organizational discipline, sect fund drives, and devastating factional splits, ensuring that radicals do not build artificial barriers between themselves and the broader working class. I think this all sounds good and well, but how do you organize this in a way that is sustainable? And I don't think Draper really gives a good answer for it. While Draper concludes that a genuine mass American socialist movement is far more likely to rise from its flexible, non-sectarian framework of active militants than from fossilized dogmatic organizations that he considered microsects, we can see here that he didn't really have anything to do other than the propagation of ideas at hand as a method for dealing with the problem. Now, this brings me to Ian or Ewan, I'm not quite sure, Tilley's article in The Partisan, Thesis on the Sect Form and its Abolition, which has the distinct benefit of being from this year. All right, and now it comes from the official publication of the Revolutionary Communist Organization, which we used to call the IMT, which is, I think, is the Grantite/Woodite Trotskyist organization, which many would say is a sect itself, which is, part of the problem that so many people writing and complaining about sects also belong to things that other people would consider sects, which expands on the ongoing debate between the Australian and global far left regarding how to move past isolated microsects and build a genuine working class party. So I think we can look at this article in a way to get us to where we're at with this today. The article argues that modern far left is trapped in a structural loop of the sect form because of a variety of reasons. Rather than a sect merely being defined by a small size or unpleasant internal culture, it is defined by its foundational logic, a group that bases its entire existence and membership boundaries on an absolute agreement on an extensive, rigid set of theoretical or historical principles, rather than an active, practical political program tied to real world class struggle, which I think is fair enough. This leads to an artificial divide in consciousness for them, Tilley argues. A core thesis in Tilley's text is that the sect form creates an artificial divide between the working class spontaneity, everyday economic and social struggles, things like trade unionism or working class riots, and revolutionary theory. Sects operate under a hubristic assumption that the ordinary workers are only capable of spontaneous action, and that the sect's job is to hoard the correct line in isolation until the revolutionary moment of spontaneity arrives, thus guiding the principle forward. And in some ways, Tilley sounds like he's actually critiquing Draper's attempt to deal with this problem. His article critiques this, arguing that a true party cannot be declared into existence by fiat or ideological purity. It must be an instrument that organically crystallizes around the political will of the class and its various prior organizational forms. The text also goes on to argue that historical presence, particularly within the Bolshevik tradition based on Bolshevik actions after 1921 during the end of the Civil War, were a major symptom of the sect form, which led to things like an unnecessary ban on internal factions, one that it was unclear if Lenin wanted to maintain all of his life, but was maintained afterwards, even in Trotskyist formations. The article points out that the Bolsheviks were deeply factional in a multi-tendency party during the 1917 revolution, and the later banning of internal factions was a historical mistake accelerated by bureaucratic degeneration, and maybe from necessities of the Civil War, but maintaining them beyond that was a problem. Thus, Tilley argues the modern sect form emulates this simulation by demanding total ideological uniformity, which leads to a continuous cycle of bittle splits, expulsions, and further fragmentations back down to the microsect level. This calls for an abolishing of the sect form, but by the partyist strategy, not the Marxist center strategy. So one is the call for unity in action, which is to me somewhat obvious, but rather than pursuing total victory of one's own microgroup to the detriment of the brother social movement and socialist movement, organizations should engage in constant dialogue, building a common electoral front, united, not popular. I'm guessing this author feels, and I would agree with that, and work together in social movements. That this should be done on a unity Congress model. That the ultimate abolition of sect form does not come from one group successfully recruiting everyone else. We're not doing the primitive accumulation of cadres. Instead, it requires a series of unity congresses, like what happened with the Eisenkerners and the Lassallians, where distinct socialist organization, caucuses, and tendencies formally fuse while maintaining some of their prior identity. This leads to a multi-tendency mass party, kind of like the Catholic Church as opposed to Protestants. The end goal is the refoundation of a unified Communist Party operating on a one-member, one-vote system. Crucially, the abolition of the sect form requires that previous independent organizations dissolve themselves to become open internal factions within a single programmatically unified but ideologically diverse mass party. So we see a reversal of some of Draper's stances, and Tilley's work aligns both with the current grant model of organization in the RCO, as well as like things like the Neo-Kautskyist organization of the CPGB Provisional Committee, or Cosmonaut Magazine, or the Marxist Unity Group in its organ line there. Ultimately, the article serves as a call to arms for fractured leftist groups to surrender their sectarian commitments to their own isolated political fiefdoms and engage in the broader intellectual life of the working class, and to prioritize building structural architecture of a mass revolutionary party that has many tendencies within it. The document represents a continuous, culmination of this debate, although going back to the second and early third international formations for how we should handle this. Now, I think these three documents are interesting because it's basically me picking three somewhat random points over the period of 150 years. After all, there are almost 100 years between the letter and Hal Draper's argument, and then 50 years between Hal Draper's argument and Tilley's. Each addresses the exact same historical problem, the tendency of the radical left to isolate itself into dogmatic, inactive sects or factions that are also ineffective even when they are active, rather than building a mass political vehicle for the working class. I do think they differ based on a couple of their historical contexts and what is causing them to actually deliver the polemics, etc. So there is a common enemy of these three texts, and that is the sect form is a dead end that actively hards the working class movement. And all three authors basically agreed that a sect is defined not necessarily by its small size, but by the logic that creates its size. A sect treats its specific political program, historical interpretations, and ideological slogans as sacred gospels and a panacea for everything. Marx, Draper, and Tilley all argue that sects demand the working class bend to specific dogmatic recipes rather than meeting the working class where they're actually at. And trade unions are spontaneous struggles, or tenants organizations, or whatever, and lifting its consciousness through active participation. All three reject artificial ideological purity, and that this purity will always lead to splitting and the formation of more microsects. But their solution differs just a little bit. Marx argues for subordination and merging, although with some hard lines that came out in his Gotha critique. While the General Association of German Workers, of the ADAV, was dissolved by the state because of the anti-socialist laws, Mahl believes that Schweitzer could have viewed it as an opportunity to let the sectarian group die so that its members can actually flow into the broader general class movement. And Lassalle could be honored by their influence on the broader movement. Draper, who's writing in 1973, when there is no mass working class movement that exists in the United States and where unions were viewed skeptically, argued that you cannot simply create a party by fiat or decree. Marx would probably agree with that, but he was in a different condition. Doing so just creates a new sect. Thus, his solution is organizational minimalism, not subordination and merging. He advocated for hanging loose, building local circles, and working with political centers like editorial boards, magazines, and worker centers. Today, he wouldn't call that back then, rather than binding oneself to sect discipline, which isolates radicals from their fellow workers and from society at large. All well and good, but how you maintain this over a long period of time and it doesn't just become a magazine and that's all it is a big question, one that's never really been answered. Tilly argues that we should not actually take Draper's hang loose minimalism as sufficient for building a political movement that could challenge state power. Instead, they talk about a refoundation unity cycle that sounds a lot like the subordination and merging of Marx, but with more specific goals and targets because the time is different and things are more advanced now. Tilly argues that the sect form must be abolished through deliberate formal fusions of existing groups, basically agreeing with Marx. But unlike monolithic sects, this new party must have an open legal internal factions to coexist under a single banner and not allow faction battles to become zero-sum fights to the death, leading to splitting, purges, or even outright war. The text tracked also a shifting view on internal dissent. Marx critiques Lassalle for giving his movement a religious character, which inherently stifles debate and thus stifles the ability of the organization to grow from the learning of the working class as a whole. By 2006, the partisan article by Tilly diagnoses the exact same issue as a structural inheritance of 20th century Stalinism, the ban on factions. Now, I think the faction ban comes from more than Stalinism. Most Trotskyist parties maintained it, and some leftcom ones do. And I tend to view it as a product of the Civil War being maintained for far too long. The 2006 article contrasts modern microsect with the historic 1917 Bolsheviks, arguing that the Revolutionary Party was originally a vibrant, multi-tendency, deeply factional democracy. While Draper sought to avoid factional nightmare by staying unaligned to any sect, even ones within larger organizations, Tilly argues that this nightmare must be resolved inside a new kind of party by legalizing differences of opinion shared under a shared action plan or program. The program being the minimum standard of what could be acceptable. So you still have grounds for saying there aren't people who are going to let in. There have to be lines. But what lines there are going to remain up in the air. Tilly seems to be generally aligned with what we would now call like neo-Kautskyism, or I tend to view it as soft Leninism because I don't like being associated with Kautsky after 1914. But nonetheless, I do think that it is something to look at. So if Karl Marx gives us a foundational diagnosis, then we have to ask ourselves, why did we still get here? And I think some of that is structural and not just ideological. And if I had one critique of all these arguments, even Marx's, although Marx would probably make this elsewhere, I don't think this is not implicit in his thought, that part of the problem is where we are with the nature of the working class itself, while also the appeal of having coherent lifestyle ideologies ready-made for you, particularly when you're a high-demand group that needs high volunteer ratios to maintain yourself. Warning radicals not to let organizational structures isolate them from the working class is very vital, but we have to be able to build a party in the first place. And I don't think we've completely answered this, because one can accuse every one of these groups, and Draper and Tilly, etc., of being sects. After all, Two of the writers are at least loosely associated with Trotskyism, one by being in Trotskyist magazine, the other one by being a leader of a Trotskyist faction. I don't have a good answer for sects, except I'd rather them be controlled by a program and in a similar organization. If we know that we're going to have ideological and interpretational clustering, trying to ban them seems foolish and seems like a way to just have constant zero-sum battles, either outright through purges and even murder, or by implication, through exclusions and splintering. I think there's room for a lot of different orders of socialists to exist in a mass socialist movement, because there are many different types of workers who need to be in that movement. And on that note, protect your peace. Like and subscribe. You can find more behind the paywall where I talk about this, and I link these in the show notes. Hope you have a great day. And always remember to not give up in fighting for a better tomorrow.